co-host, Dr. Sasha Alex Lessin. You're listening to Revolution Radio Studio D. Our producer is Tommy Becker, also known as an adjunctor. And today, I'm going to hook up connection right. And he is talking about Planet Nibiru. And Jim has served as the Planetarium Director of the Neil Armstrong Planetarium in Altoona, Pennsylvania. This is 2003. He is a high school astronomy teacher. He co-founded the Space Race Museum in the planetarium's lobby in 2016 and founded the Mount Lion Observatory at Fort Roberdeau. How do you pronounce that? Roberdeau. Historic Site in 2018. Roberdeau. Okay. Jim hosts public and private sky shows throughout the year and teaches a 9-week adult evening course with topics ranging from conspiracies to UFOs to the Apollo missions to night sky study every winter. And he's a state director for MUFON in Pennsylvania. And he has presented at 3 statewide conferences today. He also co-hosts the Majestic Ears Only podcast with fellow MUFON field director Geis and teaching colleague Brock Seese James. Has a number of fascinating presentations on space, NASA, moonwalks, and astronomy. And he is going to be sharing his presentation called Planet Nibiru. There is a conference coming up in April, right? That's why we're having this discussion to help promote the conference. Before I bring you on, Jim, let me say hi to Dr. Lessin. Hi.
Hi.
What do you want to say about our topic today?
Listen, I'm really super interested in the Andy Lloyd's conception that Nemesis, the binary to Solaris that he says was shown by infrared, and Harrington was even assassinated because of it, that this is causing part of the climate change that we're experiencing, and that all the inner planets are heating up. And I just wonder what your take on Nemesis is and on the infrared information.
Welcome to our show, Jim.
Thank you both for having me. I'm looking forward to it.
We're excited to be talking about this today. I'm going to turn up the sound a little bit. I think we got the feedback problem situated. So tell us about just a little. And I have been researching the Anunnaki, and we have like 5 books we've written, but we're always open to more information and who's got what angle, and because it's really a big field. And
absolutely.
So tell us about what you've learned.
Sure. I think it really does start with Zecharia Sitchin. And as you all probably know, he made some rather controversial translations of Sumerian cuneiform tablets. And the cuneiform comes from the meaning for wedge shape, where the Sumerians would basically take a wedge-shaped piece of wood and indent it into wet clay. And then as that hardened, that basically became the first form of writing. And there's one particular seal that really drew Sitchin's eye that appeared to have what he strongly believed was evidence of a sun-centered 12-planet solar system that the Sumerians knew about. And on the seal in particular, it seems to show the sun at the center and at least 10 or 11 objects of different sizes that Sitchin believed was a representation of our own solar system. And this would have been a really, really big deal because Europe didn't even come around to the idea of the heliocentric or sun-centered universe until at least the 1600s with the work of Nicholas Copernicus, Galileo Galilei. And so the Sumerians, we're talking anywhere between 4,000 and 5,000 BC. And so this was a really big deal. And so Sitchin basically likened these objects to the relative sizes of planets in our solar system. But there was one big difference. There was an extra large object that we don't currently recognize today. And based on his translations, he believed that according to the Sumerian legend, this object was originally called Marduk, And it was basically pulled into our solar system by the sun, which the Sumerians knew as Apsu. And on its way into our solar system, the outer planets, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune, gradually changed its orbit to where it collided directly with an earlier planet that the Sumerians called Tiamat. And during this collision, Tiamat was essentially broken in half, and it was held loosely together. And then during Marduk's next pass, the gravitational pull essentially tore it apart. And according to his translations, half of Tiamat then became the asteroid belt, and the other half, along with one captured moon, basically became Earth and our moon, Luna. And then Marduk then looped back out into the outer solar system and then became known as Nibiru, or the one that passes through. And so Sitchin obviously also comes up when we talk about ancient aliens. You would have to put he and von Däniken right up there at the top for getting credit for basically starting that movement. And I think he was a brilliant man. I think to show both sides of the story, one of the difficult things is there's only a handful of people on Earth that can actually translate ancient Sumerian cuneiform. And so it's definitely up for debate, but that's where at least the Sitchin angle comes from Nibiru, and I really find it fascinating.
Go ahead, honey.
Oh, well, one interesting thing from my perspective is that given the Sitchin hypotheses, you can say certain things are predictable given, is it true or not that there's water and planets and the other kinds of things that were mentioned in the Enuma Elish. And so there's testable stuff, whether they anthropomorphized astronomical movements or not. You can still see, is this tale bearing any testable hypotheses?
I think that it does, especially when you compare it to other solar systems. There is a big debate on our own asteroid belt. So the perspective of mainstream science, these are basically pieces of our early solar system that never actually coalesced into a planet. But then you have a separate hypothesis. Some people actually believe that the asteroid belt was the remains of an original planet, and perhaps they speculate advanced civilization there who inadvertently blew themselves up, then moved to Mars, and then onto the Earth. I'm somewhat leaning more towards.
Wait, let me just say with the asteroid belt and the implications of Tiamat being struck by Marduk is that the asteroids would be made of the same Tiamat, which became Terra, which became Earth. Is testable.
Absolutely, it is. One of the only counter is I've read where you could take every asteroid in the asteroid belt, lump it to essentially be smaller than the moon. Further, astronomers asteroid belts already in orbit around other stars. So that certainly doesn't thing that Sitchin said, but it definitely does show that asteroid belts probably are fairly common throughout the Milky Way.
Yeah, there's another one, the belt further out where they say Maldek used to be.
Correct. That's a flattened disk of comets that's out by the orbits of Neptune and Pluto. And so we do get some of our shorter period comets from there. And then the one other structure we should probably mention, which so far is just theorized, is called the Oort cloud. And that was named after an astronomer, Jan Oort, who speculated it would be there. And it's essentially a theoretical shell of trillions of comets that would surround our entire solar system. And Oort basically proposed it to try to explain where these long coming from. If it is there, these comets would be a lot more dangerous. They could come at us from any direction. But so far, they haven't actually proved it, and it would be far enough away that it would actually be upwards of over a light year away from us. So we're talking really far out.
Wow.
So what you're saying is there's a lot of collisions in space. But what might have happened to a planet that was broken down into the asteroid belt. Could something else have happened to some of the asteroids, or does that eliminate that as a possibility? Mass doesn't equal the size of a planet. What are we actually saying there?
Was it little bitty chips that came off, or a big chunk?
Sure. I think you're both on the right track. Vision could have definitely explained a lot of the missing mass, because you have to realize a large portion of that could have actually gone into the sun. Rise. So long story short, just because the current mass, the asteroid belt, doesn't add up to much more than the mass of our moon, I also don't think that disproves that there could have been an early collision. And as you allude to, Dr. Sasha, it does also answer to some of the anomalies that we have with the Earth-Moon system that mainstream astronomy can't totally figure out an answer for yet.
And what about Velikovsky's theory? Now, it's been years since I even looked at that, Velikovsky, but I thought he said something about Mercury was somehow brought into its orbit, part of this dance of the planet. So Mercury, I don't know if part of this asteroid belt, and it kept.
They have this thing about Jupiter moving in and then moving back out, and with it in terms of his gravity. Some astronomers are
really confusing to really even understand exactly what they're saying.
Is he the author that wrote Worlds in Collision? Because it's one of Albert Einstein's favorite books.
I should look it up knowing the topic today, but I think that's what it was called. I'll look it right now, Velikovsky. But when I was a young lass, I was very excited about von Däniken and Velikovsky, and then I found Sitch. Plus, I'm an experiencer, so I was really was coming out and still am. So it's great to connect the dots. Someone else that can help figure this out, and especially an astronomer like yourself. Now, we were talking to Andy Lloyd, right?
Yeah.
And he's from the UK, and I'm thinking it would be great sometime to have both of you on at the same time, but it's hard to coordinate the UK because it's like in the middle of the morning for them during the time of this show. But okay, so go ahead, ask each other questions. I'm gonna sit back and listen to you.
Well, okay. Very complicated in terms of Babylon. Because Prince Marduk, Lucifer, wound up being in charge of the world from the Sumerian point of view. Started saying that in renaming the planet, it wasn't Tiamat anymore. And the priests acted out. It was now called Marduk, and he changed the names. Different dynasties of rulers came. They would change the names of planets to become the name of their tutelary leader, and so that's why the names keep changing throughout the different histories.
And you're correct, Dr. Sasha. There is a lot of confusion, and I've also noticed in my own research there's a lot of overlap, which only adds to the confusion. For example, Nemesis. Some people take Nemesis to be equivalent to Nibiru, whatever this visitor might be. But then I've also seen it used in reference to the idea that there's actually a second Earth. So essentially another Earth directly opposite the sun behind us. And that's one theory that I've never really been able to get behind. Like, even if there was an object directly opposite us from the sun, not only would we be able to send space probes there, but just because of the mass and its gravitational pull, we would be able to tell that it's there even without being able to see it. So just to your earlier point, to Janet's point, there's also, and we can get into this a little bit later, but there's a lot of overlap in the nomenclature. Sometimes people phrase Planet X to refer to Nibiru. Some Planet X used just to talk about the current search from mainstream astronomy for Planet 9. So it definitely adds to the confusion.
James, about being on the opposite side, there's something called the Lagrange points, which are brightest that always stay either 180 or 360 degrees away from where the primary bundle of gravity is. And so I can understand that there would be that's how you could conceive a hypothesis of another object that we don't see if it's in the Lagrange point area.
Certainly, each planetary system has 5 of them, and as you said, Dr. Sasha, straight line with the Earth's sun, one opposite between the Earth and sun, and then a third opposite the sun, and then 2 at basically 60 degrees from that. So far as they've found asteroids collected in Jupiter's Lagrangian points called Trojan asteroids, and NASA actually used Earth's own Lagrangian actually park telescopes out there, because if they can actually get them into these points, it takes actually keep them there. The only issue with an actual twin planet is if there was one out of the sun, based on Newton's laws of motion, Kepler's laws of planetary motion, they would still be able to detect the mass. In fact, that's actually how they found Neptune. Sometimes they dub Neptune the mathematician's planet because regularities in Uranus's orbit, and they knew something else had to be out there.
Thank you. Thank you.
So also, sometimes they're saying Nemesis, and maybe they're referring to Nibiru and its entire solar system. It has a number of planets associated and moons and things as well, correct?
Yeah, satellites.
And satellites.
Yeah, that's one of the interesting takes. I believe, according to Sitchin's translations, Nibiru, as it came in, actually had multiple satellites orbiting around it to add to the complexity, which isn't out of the realm of possibility for such a large planet. And according to his belief, 4 of them were stripped off as it passed by Jupiter to form satellites, the 4 largest moons of Jupiter. And then one of them was stripped off during the collision, and that up accompanying the other half of Tiamat, which then became Arm. So I think a lot of it is very speculative, but I'm also very interested in alternative theories to explain the presence of our moon. Because, go ahead, Dr.
The same thing is so of Iapetus is exactly the same kind of almost a moon, and that is consistent with the Sitchin hypothesis of a moon being stripped off, entering that kind of a thing, being Iapetus. And Farrell has actually looked, and he shows this huge ridge that looks like it's a deliberate, goes around the entire perimeter from north to south of Iapetus, which is a huge moon of Jupiter's.
Certainly does look odd, doesn't it?
You've seen the pictures then.
Iapetus, our own moon Luna, and then Mars's one asteroid moon Phobos are likely the most anomalous moons in our solar system. And a podcast just about the moon, but 2 big curiosities about our moon and then Phobos is gravitational readings show that large parts of both of them are mostly hollow. And it's been proven a number of different ways, and it's sort of of any traditional formation theory of our solar system.
Right. So there's speculation that they're artificial. There's the when they had the experiment where I guess the lander landed or something, and it echoed and kept ringing like a bell.
If we have time to talk about that, Janet, it's fascinating. Yeah, they've done a number of experiments that way. If you're interested.
Yeah, we're free flow here. We can say whatever we want. I just what I thought is that the brown dwarf was called Nibiru. I mean,
Nemesis.
Nemesis. Nibiru rotates around the brown. This is a binary star system. One being a what do you call it? The brown dwarf. What is a brown dwarf? It's in the other range of.
It's a dwarf, and so it doesn't. You can't see it except by a spectral that gets infrared. And the story is that Harrington went down to the Naval Observatory in Australia to confirm data that they had, and he came back and said, yeah, there's this big body up there and it's got stuff going around it and we can see it on our infrared data. And he had an interview with Sitchin, and soon after that Harrington died of a sudden and mysterious death. Some people
cancer that was developed in a couple days.
People punished for blabbing to Zachariah.
Yeah, Sitchin.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think officially they claimed that he had cancer of the esophagus and then died only 5 days later. And obviously we had family members affected by cancer, but it would be quite curious for a totally healthy person to track cancer and then be gone only 5 days later. And so I found the Harrington story both fascinating and tragic. He had done his own calculations, and as you alluded to, he believed the object could be visible, but only from the southern hemisphere. And it didn't take him very long to find it. The U.S. Naval Observatory and NASA that he had found it. And the other fascinating thing to me that makes conspiratorial, soon after he died, the mainstream scientific completely shifted on the idea of Planet Nine, because a lot of people don't realize, they assume the notion has been ridiculed. But from 1950 up to 1983, it was actually taken very seriously. In fact, just as astronomers had found Neptune by looking at Uranus, they saw very similar anomalies in Neptune's orbit, and they realized Pluto alone was not enough to explain it, so they continued to look. And in 1983, NASA announced with their IRAS, their infrared telescope that's orbiting in space, that they had actually found an object at least as big as Jupiter lurking in the outer part of the solar system. And this is actually an official NASA announcement. It made newspapers across the country and the world. And then only a day later, the story was pulled, and the astronomers' discovery said they had just made a mistake, and it was of gas and dust. So it certainly is curious how many seem to come very close to discovering it, and then for some reason, a lid of secrecy is just clamped down, and then the whole story changes.
And what do you think, if there is a lid of secrecy being clamped? What would be the motive behind clamping down on that information, which anyone can see observing the data?
That's a great question, Dr. Sasha. My personal belief is if they were clamping down, it would likely be because if this object is really solar system again, it is well beyond our technology as human thing about it. And I think one of the better tangential pieces of evidence I have is look at how our own government for something like this. When you look at our exploding national, sometimes people joke that our nation is spending no. And so I privately think to myself, what if they know such a scenario could be true? And in my presentation that I'm going to do for the MUFON conference, I go on to about deep underground bases, or DUMBs. We seem to know the United States has been building them in earnest since the 50s, and they now likely spiderweb across most of the western United States. And it certainly seems like if there was going to be something that came through, going down underground might likely be one of the only ways you might stand a chance to be safe from what could be a very large gravitational disturbance.
Well, I visited one of the DUMBs in Pennsylvania when I lived in Pittsburgh. Oh. I don't remember exactly what it was.
In Johnson Atoll.
And then I was in one at Johnson Atoll. So they might be just all over the world because the elite definitely want to survive.
Garcia, too.
something in the
news
about Diego Garcia recently. I meant to tell you, but I forgot. And I wanted to say one more thing about the deaths. So we had not only Harrington, but we had Lloyd Pye, who piecing together some information after Sitchin died, and he went to the museum and he was trying to get the museum to do the analysis on the DNA of what was it,
Princess Puabi. Lagash.
Yeah, Lagash. So they have her in the base, and Sitchin left millions of dollars to get the analysis, and then the family apparently took it and won't let it be. And then Lloyd came back and he said, he called. He said, I had cancer, and oh my God, and I'll be dead soon. So he was dead in like a couple months. He really tried everything, fast-acting cancers, and then another. They did. I'm saying they did it too. I'll just say it. They did it too. I don't know who the they is. They did it. Was A.R. Borden, who was apparently revealing information about and how it came through. And anyway, he had an organization that was meeting. The minutes of his last meeting said that the meeting with extraterrestrials, including Anunnaki, and they were coming in. And do you want to tell a story about how they had to get the Earth out of the way? You have it.
What they were saying is in the perigee of Nibiru, they had this time, which was December 21st, 2012. There would be a disastrous closeness, a coincidence of the clockwise orbit of Nibiru and the anti-clockwise orbit of Earth, so that they came in such close proximity that terrible disturbances on Earth. And so what Penray and Borden papers say is that the extraterrestrials had some way of altering space-time. The danger is past. And that's lovely wishful thinking, and we're still here.
Right.
So,
it's interesting that
we hear all these interesting theories. But go ahead. What's yours?
Well, it's interesting that every time somebody predicts something related to doomsday, it hasn't come true so far, and then they always adjust and say, well, our calculation. I was rather curious to see if anything would happen to solve myself. But then when it didn't, I did think it was a little bit of a stretch that extraterrestrials were altering space-time to try to save us from that. So I tend to agree. I think that was a little bit of a stretch.
And yet you never...
That's true.
But anyway.
What I do is I would try to say what evidence would make it more likely and what less likely, and you can then say, is this? It doesn't matter if your hypothetical constructs are a bunch of nonsense. It just matters if you have a predictive model or not, because all of our hypotheses are intellectual tools for which we try to sort things.
You're Dr. Sasha, may I give two other potential pieces of evidence that do support something to be true? Oh, excellent. So prior death from about 83, so this takes us from when NASA makes the announcement of another body, then pulls the announcement prior to Harrington's death. Some take a serious look at the extinction event happened here on the Earth that we can confirm. So not over 65 million years ago, but then an even larger event for that opened the niche for the dinosaurs, which was called the Great Dying about 200 years ago. And they started to ask whether the periodic passing of an object from the outer reaches of the solar system could cause these extinction levels. And I found that absolutely fascinating, but right when Harrington died, all of that research seems to go away. So we're looking for new evidence. That's one place that we could look at again. Another thing that out a lot, but I personally hypothesize the data, is the actual tilts of the planets, because based on the system model, all the planets should have essentially formed with near vertical axes. And in our solar system right now, there's only one planet that actually has that, and that's Mercury. Its rotational axis is only about 1/10 a degree off from. All the other planets have been disturbed to some degree. Current mainstream theory is that they were based on asteroids or comets or other solar system debris. But I think what's more likely is if something did loop through our inner solar system, it may not have things, but just the gravitational pull from it could have absolutely distorted these. And the two planets in particular that I like, Venus and Uranus. If you just do a quick glance at a diagram of Venus, it looks like the axis is basically vertical. But what a lot of people don't realize is it's actually tipped upside down. Venus actually orbits about 177 degrees off of vertical, and it actually now spins slowly backwards, which is called retrograde rotation. And a day on Venus now is actually longer than a year. And so the big hit into Venus a long time ago and knocked it upside down, but haven't been able to find any super crater on Venus that can actually explain it. So you could argue that Venus has a young surface that's being resurfaced and it may have disappeared, but that also still leaves us the matter of Uranus. Uranus is a lot of your listeners planet, a gas giant, and its axis is actually tipped over sideways, and it essentially rolls like a barrel backwards. So again, the mainstream is that something big hit into Uranus, but unlike Venus being largely gas, I think it would be awfully difficult for something to hit in. Direct shot on the tiny rock is at the center. To me, it seems a lot simpler that something would have passed through and the gravitational pull of it basically knocked the planets into different tilts. And there are some writings from the ancients that seem to suggest that thing.
Yeah. I think it was, I don't know if it was Hamlet's Mill or something, but basically what Sitchin and the people following him have said is that on one of the past, perhaps the one around the time of Moses' flood down the Red Sea, going off of Stromboli and sinking of the Minoan fleet. At that time, that's when the disturbance happened, and they said it was from a nearness of to Uranus, which did two things besides tilting Uranus through from 3,600 year elongated orbits, and then Nibiru, look at it, never goes around Solaris. It just passes between and Jupiter, and that it sped it to 3,050 years. It sped that planet up at how its periodicity, and so that's also checkable.
That's interesting.
And also about in the Enuma Elish, specifically, they say it was a collision that caused the Pacific Basin to form, and the Pacific Basin doesn't have a mantle of 65 miles like most of the Earth's surface. It only has 12 miles, and that's all from alluvium and from volcanic spewings, rather than this kind of extensive crust. So that evidence, Sitchin felt, for lack of a crust under the Pacific and this huge that the Pacific Ocean is, and that was partly what was responsible for the creation of Pangaea and landforms when this hole drained all the wall. What do you think of those hypotheses? Yeah,
I think one of the most fascinating to me is if you take a look back at a lot of the earliest religious texts, which prior to maybe the 1970s and the ancient aliens theory were just essentially ancient folklore or science fiction, it does really provide a scientific context for why a number have actually happened. The Chinese, for example, around the time of the Great Flood, excellent naked eye astronomers. They left very, very detailed records. In a quick example, part of the reason modern astronomers were able to figure out that Halley's Comet looped around every 76 years is that they found that the Chinese astronomers had been tracking it for thousands of years. Well, the Chinese have a very interesting account of actually seeing 3 suns in the sky. And they said as soon as the 3 suns appeared, there was a period of earthquakes and tsunamis. And their writings say that the tsunamis, the tidal waves of water, were so large that they actually crashed miles inland, and they formed brand new lakes that took decades. I also am fascinated by great flood stories. I grew up through Catholic school. I went to Catholic school from kindergarten through senior high school, and my religion's still very important to me today. But up until a couple of years ago, I just sort of assumed the flood had to be an allegory, because you could never build an ark large enough to get 2 of every end. Even if you could, let's say
we're all in the same neighborhood. He had with the polar bears.
Right, absolutely. And even if you could, once they got back on land, you still would only have 2 of every species, so you would have from the start. But what I found fascinating is I learned that there are over 1,300 world that have their own great flood stories, and it's even of Gilgamesh, which is the oldest story that we have. And a common through these, whether it's through a talking fish, whether it's through an angelic messenger, whether it's a dream, a voice of God, but some humans to build ships, gather up as many living beings as they embrace for a flood. And so I start to think to myself, what if there's a chance that the passing of Nibiru, or the solar system, temporarily slowed down the rotation of the Earth? Because we really only think about Earth's rotation when we look at the sky, and we tend to assume from our human-based perspective, standing still and the sky is moving. But obviously that's a convention. We're spinning at least 1,000 miles an hour.
So Zechariah has actually talked about when Joshua and Moses' mob were chasing some of their enemies, and it was about to get dark, and Joshua were about to quit. Their leader, the extraterrestrial, said, "Hey, you know, it's going to be like a long time now, because Earth, and at the same on the other side of the Earth in Yucatan, stayed dark for 22 hours." And so there's a recorded event in history where the could be explained, Sitchenfeld, the Earth didn't, because of the gravitational presence object in the sky.
And one of the terrifying consequences of that is, let's say we're rotating right now and something temporarily stops the rotation of the Earth. The land masses may have stopped, but all the water and all the air on Earth continue to move at 1,000 miles per hour for some time. Boom, that could be your great flood story right there. If the land masses suddenly stopped and the water kept moving, that could easily be a motive for just massive entire Earth's surface by water.
That's right. And when water of great weight moves like that, changes how the continents float.
I read years ago, and I don't have it current, but it said that when Nibiru is going out again, that's when the gravitational pull stops the rotation, and it makes this horrendous sound. The Earth is howling, is screeching, because it's being stopped suddenly. And
wow.
So, one of the theories. I wish I had that. I don't remember where I read that. Is that one of Sitchin's books?
Nope.
It was some other account of Nibiru. There's a lot of places.
But people during the time that Nibiru was a few years back, people said they were hearing sounds from the Earth.
Yeah.
Well, you could actually, they're not wrong. You can actually go onto YouTube and listen to them. People made very accurate recordings, and likened it to basically the Trump trumpets of the apocalypse, which were foreseen in Revelation by John, and geologists comment on it because it was so widespread, and they simply dismissed it as earth sounds. They basically made some vague allusion to sounds being caused by the tectonic plates moving. But for me personally, answer. But Janet, you're absolutely right. People recorded those sounds and posted them online, and you can definitely check them out. It's pretty wild.
Great. Wow.
Another interesting. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was just going to fill in with the question, but go ahead. Another interesting.
Oh, just briefly bringing up Revelation. Some people, just for the backstory, people aren't totally sure whether John, the Apostle John, actually wrote it. Because what happened a lot during biblical times, if you had something that you really wanted to say, but you were a nobody, a lot of people would essentially ghostwrite for one, then, like the Apostle Paul or John. But whoever actually wrote Revelation, it is the final book of the Bible. And like it is an accurate depiction of some end time event for the earth. And one of the things I've always found fascinating is whoever wrote it describes what he calls wormwood, which is basically some visitor that comes into the solar system. And when terrible things start to happen on the earth. And I just think to myself, why would he call it wormwood? But I think perhaps it could have been a large brown object, hence the wood part, and seemingly had storms on that might have looked like holes, hence the worm. Long story short, I think the parallels between what a brown dwarf might look like versus what John described as wormwood were definitely fascinating.
That's interesting.
Yeah, yeah, fascinating. Yeah,
I like connecting the dots with somebody else. It's like you're thinking outside of this box.
But what gets me is that professional astronomers shut up. And even Carl Sagan lied to cover up the. What I think maybe behind a lot of the cover up isn't just the technology, but the and the illicit use of the money for all kinds of terrible things, not just for military secrets that they're doing. That's my underlying hypothesis. There's criminality under it.
As much as Carl, a great influencer of popular science, and I certainly he's a wonderful storyteller. But as you alluded to, a lot of his thought processes very inconsistent matter of extraterrestrials. For example, when he in Cosmos praised a lot of the Greek scientists that went against the grain and essentially made discoveries because they didn't just go along with what was taught. He really had high praise for that, and that's the way that's see. But when it came to matters of extraterrestrial life, he was highly critical of any idea that extraterrestrials could have come here. And he had actually recommended that we just rely on take on it because they surely would be true. So Sagan was certainly a man of contradiction. Some people feel that Sagan took that peculiar stance on extraterrestrials because he essentially was on the inside. He was given the real scoop, but public, much like some of the members of Majestic 12, like Dr. astronomer from Harvard, publicly Sagan, to fulfill his role, had to debunk it to people.
I just Googled wormwood, and there was a show just earlier, 7 hours ago, the Wormwood Prophecy, asteroid striking the Earth in 2029. Today, Tom Horn with Sid Roth Sunday show. So, but the pictures are showing like an asteroid. They're calling wormwood some kind of asteroid hitting the Earth. It's supposed to hit them. I think like later on this month or something.
It says right there.
Well, no, the show was just today. 7 hours ago, they did a show called The Wormwood Prophecy. Everybody else saying when it's supposed to hit. So that's
2029, Janet, comes up quite a lot with this. A friend of mine, John Ventry, who used to be the state director for Pennsylvania MUFON, and he had made on the History Channel, wrote a book called Apophis 29, and I believe Apophis is an Earth crossing act, so it actually crosses the orbit of the Earth, but luckily so far it's never done it when the but it's supposed to be a record close approach, and mainstream astronomy has watched it very, very closely, and they assure us that it will not get within strike distance of the Earth. But some people are definitely looking at that year as the next potential close call.
Yeah, I think Brass was saying that's not going to hit, but yeah, go ahead.
Well, just one interesting things. I don't know if it's true or not, but when the planets line up, as they did at certain times with the galactic core, collective, yes, I think the answer has to be yes. Their collective gravity has to be increased if they're in a line.
I think there might be a chance of that. Now, in fairness, I have read that it's impossible for all 8 or 9 planets of our solar system to actually straight line. I think that happened in the movie Tomb Raider with Angelina Jolie, which was a terrible movie overall. I've also heard the galactic core. I think that one has a little bit more likelihood, simply because a lot of people don't totally understand the way it revolves. And for a lot of years, I didn't either. We think about our galaxy, think about the spiral arms, and we tend to think that our sun is basically what's called the Orion arm, and the whole arm basically pirouettes around the galactic core. A little bit different than that. In some areas of the Milky Way that are essentially stationary in terms of distribution of gas, and basically we orbit through those areas. Basically, sometimes we'll go through areas where there are larger amounts of debris, and then sometimes we'll go through areas that are relatively free of debris. And so I think it's at least an interesting hypothesis. Could potentially explain Earth's history. We've had extinction level events, and then we go for a time where we have them.
Thank you.
What do you think of, excuse me, sorry, I drank some, the creation story that Sitchin presents?
I think it has potential, and I think it's really fast. It actually dovetails pretty well with the creation story of Genesis in the Old Testament. So I believe it was Sitchin, or at least followers of Sitchin, that went back and looked at if you actually think of the creation of Earth as the result of a larger collision, then the account in Genesis, which most people just took to be an allegory or symbolic, on a much more factual context with it, if you look at Earth basically forming as the result of a collision. So I think I agree with both of you. I think it's an intriguing take, and it definitely merits further study.
Yeah, I just wanted to go back a little bit to Venus. In some accounts the CIA showed to my pal Stuart Swerdlow, it basically said that Venus, hollowed out object that passed through our solar system en route, destroying, sucking most of the surface water and air off of, sucking the moisture, the totally wet atmosphere off of Earth, and raising the planet's 2 continents, Lemuria and Atlantis, and moving on to where we now call Venus, and the snow-covered ice melted off, and the Dracos who were inside came to surface, built 7 dome cities, and from there they placed the moon in our Luna, and from Luna they brought their dinosaurs, which was their beef, down to Earth, and they settled Lemuria, spread all over the planet before the Atlanteans, who were placed there by the Federation, started fighting back. Anyway, that's the CIA's take that they let Stewart read.
That's fascinating. I had not heard that hypothesis about Venus being hollow. I've heard about Luna being hollow, our moon. There's a lot of ample evidence for that. In fact, NASA's taken that seriously enough that in 2013, they sent twin space probes into orbit around the moon to try to map the gravitational anomalies beneath the crust. It was called the Grail mission. And I've also heard of Mars's moon Phobos being largely hollow. And the Soviet Union has a long history of really curious events happening when they try to explore Phobos. Do we have a minute? Can I go into just one of them? Because it's pretty fascinating.
Yeah, go for it.
Yes.
Oh, good. So far, nobody has been able to land anything on Mars's asteroid moon Phobos. So just a little backstory for your readers, or I'm sorry, your listeners. Mars and Earth are the only inner planets that have moons. And Mars has 2 of them, but unlike our moon, they're very tiny. They're called Phobos and Deimos. And officially, they are captured asteroids. So at some point in Mars's past, 2 asteroids got too close to Mars, and then Mars sucked them in with its gravitational pull, and they now orbit to this day. These moons were actually brought up again during the Obama administration, because during his ambitious plans for Mars, which were not realized, they envisioned putting transfer stations on Phobos and then sending people down to Mars from Phobos, perhaps with a space elevator. So back to the Soviets, they once tried to land a probe on Phobos that was called Phobos 2. And I believe this was in the 1980s. And the mission was going fairly routinely. But as they started to approach Phobos, an anomalous object came into close proximity with their probe, seemingly out of nowhere. And it actually collided with the probe and destroyed the probe. And so, beaming back telemetry and its photographs, the Soviets were able to get the last couple of photographs from the Phobos 2 lander. And they actually picked up an anomalous object that appeared to be speeding towards it. And probably most creepily of all, on the surface of the moon itself, it even photographed a disc-shaped shadow racing across the surface of the moon before the probe was destroyed. And the Soviets were actually fairly open about this. They sent one of their test pilot astronauts named Marina Popovich on a speaking tour of the United States, and she actually presented the photograph, and you can see the anomalous object in it. Now, NASA shot back and said it's not really an object, it's just a camera artifact that's there. And so officially NASA claims that it just got destroyed on its own. But what's very curious about Phobos, and like our moon, is they know that it's largely hollow inside. And the only mainstream explanation I've found to even try to explain this is that Phobos might not be a full asteroid, but a loose rubble pile that's then been covered over with dust, and so it only looks like an asteroid. And I'm fairly skeptical of that, because I think the tidal forces from Mars's gravitational pull, if it wasn't really a solid object but a rubble pile, I think it would be pulled apart pretty quickly. So not to diverge too much, Dr. Sasha, but there definitely are some really interesting tales about hollow objects, just like Janet alluded to, the moon ringing like a bell when the Apollo astronauts crashed the descent stage into it. But this is honestly the first time I've heard about Venus being hollowed out inside.
We can't prove anything, but we're talking about it.
Well, yeah, but we can certainly say some very interesting things about how the planetary body the size of the moon exists, where it exists, and keeps the same face to the Earth. There's all kinds of very, very interesting things that make us, and we can also detect how much metal is inside, whether there's machines in there or not. By our space agency knows.
Do I have time to take a quick break before we come back, just for a minute? Okay, thanks.
Revolution Radio Studio B with producer Thomas Becker, and our guest is James Krug. Before we get back to our show, I'd like to remind everybody to please go over to revolution.radio, the website, and click on the tab at the top that says donations, and then there's a Patreon tab. You can make a recurring donation. We really do appreciate your donations. It helps us keep the lights on and pay the bills. So thank you for donating. Dr. Lessin, what would you like to say?
Okay, well, now that I got James, a real live astronomer, there's questions that I really would like to rap about, is how planetary systems form, and what are the variety of them, what causes the different alignments, and is there something like a Fibonacci scale showing you where planets should exist relative to their primaries, and how does it all work?
That's an excellent question, Dr. Sasha. Officially, at least in our solar system, the layout that we have, and for anybody who's listening along, our solar system, we have what are called the terrestrials. It comes from the Latin word terra, meaning earth. So these are the rocky Earth-like worlds, Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, in close to the sun. And then we have our Jovians, named after the Roman god Jove, the equivalent of the Greek Zeus. Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune in the outer part of our solar system, primarily made of gas. And so the leading theory is it is essentially a function of temperature. In close to the sun, it was too warm for gas to actually coalesce into large balls. And so we only have the terrestrials in close. But then in the outer reaches of the solar system, that's the one location where it was cool enough to actually have the Jovians form. We think, and I think we have to put an asterisk on that, because some of these other planetary systems, these extrasolar planets that astronomers are discovering, are really blowing their minds where they actually are in the diversity of systems. For example, most of the early extrasolar planets that were found were large gas giants, and they were very, very close to their stars. And they were actually found first because they imparted the largest wobble on their star, which made them easiest to detect. So there are other planetary systems out there that have planets as large or larger than Jupiter, so we know they have to be gas, and they're actually closer to their stars than Mercury is to our own sun. And when astronomers first found
let me just stop.
Yes.
Does density make any difference to gravity? How dense a planet is versus how concentrated it is? Does that affect its gravitational pull?
Oh, that's an excellent question. Overall, the pull would essentially be a function of the mass and the mass alone. A perfect density difference in our own solar system would be comparing Jupiter to Saturn. Just eyeballing the two, Saturn looks very similar volume-wise, but there is much less mass in it. Its mass, or its density, is actually less than that of water. So even though Jupiter and Saturn look similar in size, Jupiter has a far larger gravitational pull. In fact, you could actually lump all the other planets together in the solar system into a big ball, and Jupiter would still be over twice as massive as all of them put together. So the gravitational pull would be more a function of the mass than the volume of it. Just to mention, you'd mentioned the Fibonacci sequence, Dr. Sasha. The one example I could give of that in the solar system is what are called resonances. And a resonance basically means two bodies will get locked into a gravitational relationship with each other. And probably the easiest example that comes to mind is Neptune and Pluto are in what's called 3-2 resonance with each other. So Neptune will essentially make 3 orbits of the sun for every 2 orbits of the sun that Pluto makes. And so their orbits cross in a way. It might surprise people to learn that for a couple years at a time, Neptune is actually farther from the sun than Pluto. But because they're locked in this resonance with each other, they're never actually going to hit.
Wow. Does it matter which pole is orienting toward the other one, whether it's a negative or positive pole or anything like that?
Oh my gosh, I'm so glad you asked that, because one big thing I was hoping we could talk about during the second hour is not only the flip-flopping of Earth's magnetic field, but a take that a couple people have had throughout history. What if it's not just our magnetic field that is flipping? What if it's our entire planet, or it's massive shifts of the crust? So in terms of evidence, because I understand you're very evidence-based, which I love, I definitely have a lot of evidence that we could get into with that. And it even actually ties us into Atlantis and Antarctica. So there's a lot of fun things we could talk about there.
The Maya had a very similar thing to one of the hypotheses you just did about the night being a different shell that comes up and tracks over the Earth. And that's almost like one of the models you just ran through real quick.
Mm-hmm. Well, do we have time to talk about that now, or is there something else?
Yeah.
Okay,
sure.
Wonderful. Well, I actually first learned about this not from any conspiracy broadcast, but when I was in college, I took a lot of geology, even more geology than astronomy. And it actually first came up when we learned about seafloor spreading in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. So as a lot of people might not know, the biggest mountain range on Earth technically wouldn't be the Himalayas. It wouldn't be the Rockies. It would actually be the underwater mountain range that runs up the entire length of the Atlantic Ocean. And it gets high enough that it actually does peak up above the water, and that's where we have Iceland at. So this is a place that's called a divergent plate boundary, where the plates are spreading apart, and then new magma is upwelling, it's pushing up through. Well, what's fascinating is as this magma cools into hard rock, any little iron inclusions, the little flecks of iron, all basically act like compass needles. And whichever direction magnetic north is, they essentially get... Are we still on, Janet?
Yeah, we're still here. Yep.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, I had a pop-up on my screen. I apologize. So they basically get frozen in place in the rock, showing what way magnetic north was. And so geologists refer to this as zebra striping. And so for a couple thousand years, all the compass needles will be pointed one direction. And then for a couple thousand years, they're all pointed the other direction. And so this is very strong evidence that for some reason that geologists still can't explain, our entire magnetic field basically reverses every couple thousand years. And the kind of wild part is we are statistically overdue for our next reversal. And if it does happen in our lifetimes, magnetic north will become south and vice versa. And I'm somewhat alarmed by what could happen if this does take place. There's a chance that nothing happens, but there's also a chance when you look at how many of our satellites and airplanes use the Earth's magnetic field for navigation, I wonder what's going to happen when we have an entire pole flip. So mainstream geologists that there's at least a magnetic field flip. One hypothesis that I have really, really been into lately is, what if it's not just the magnetic field? What if it is our planet itself? So I know that both of you are very well versed in Sitchin. Have you read up anything about the entire Earth flipping during these times?
Not an entire Earth flipping, but there's certainly been enough stuff that I've gotten from other information. For example, the Portuguese sent some German explorers to guard the Brazilian side of the of the Amazon against the Spanish, and the Indians burned their ships and they retreated underground, and they found bioluminescent caverns and made all kinds of settlements. And after centuries and centuries, they say, they arrived at the South Pole kingdom of Bodland, where the people were speaking ancient German, and that there was a whole civilization there, and that these people periodically, 25,000, 26,000 years, there's this vast change. A Kalki is here, which corresponds with the dawning of the age of Aquarius in the Sumerian system. And so expect big changes. But, when you look at the end of days, people expect it all the time. I remember the hoarding from 2000, from when this Y2K. Mm-hmm. And so, when Creech in Festinger in Prophecy Fails shows that when prophecies of doom fail, the people that have invested in that prophecies cling to their beliefs even more strongly than ever before, especially if they gave away everything they had because they were, and then they say the world was saved because of them.
That's really fascinating. Go ahead, Janet. Sorry.
I was just saying our prayers have been answered. We are saved.
Yeah, and so you might have, and so the conclusion, I would say, the doomsdayers people, you might as well be positive and not worry about getting killed suddenly. If you get killed suddenly, at least you had fun while you're still here. And if you didn't get killed suddenly, that's cool too.
Absolutely. Well, there are a few well-respected scientists that have put out theories that our Earth doesn't just go very slow periodic change like the tectonic movement of the plates, that there can be disturbances and the entire planet can rapidly shift. And one man put forward such a theory. He's a little bit of an enigma. He is known only as Chan Thomas, and there's not a lot of background on Chan Thomas. But he wrote a book in 1963 that was called The Adam and Eve Story, The History of Cataclysms. And he actually did back this up with quite a lot of science, geology, in fact. He visited a number of areas like the Arctic Ocean, the Sudan Basin, Hudson Bay, Caspian Sea, and he used geology to try to kind of retroactively figure out where these areas would have been. And he found that a lot of them spent some time at the geographic North Pole, but then were suddenly... Yes. Go ahead.
Okay, go ahead. You finish your wrap, sure. And then I'll dovetail it.
Absolutely. So they were rapidly shifted. Well, the man must have been on to something because the CIA actually classified his book and would not allow it to be published anymore. And I did a little backstory because I thought maybe this is just an urban legend. But I found to my surprise, if you make an invention or you publish a book that is a potential threat to national security, the government can actually step in, free speech be damned, and they can actually classify it. And I believe over the last 30 years, there have been upwards of 300 different inventions or publications that the United States has actually stepped in and said, no, this is a threat to national security. So just to wrap this up, Chan Thomas's book has now been re-released, but supposedly it's a very watered-down version from the original. So it seems like the man was definitely on to something.
Wow. Okay, it does indeed. Jansen, a Norwegian sailor in the late 1800s, reported, when he got out of Norway, they're by the pole, and suddenly the compass goes ape, and they seem to be sucked into a huge river, which again sucks them into this land that even Admiral Byrd said he saw too, in the North Pole, a land of some kind of internal heating element, tunnels, caverns, and that these guys were big there. They had big animals, same like the terrestrial animals, but they were way bigger. The people were 12 to 18 feet high. They came out at the South Pole, and they said they wanted to go back, and so they went back. They hit a iceberg. The dad got kicked killed, but the son, who was 14 at the beginning of this adventure, he's like 18 or 19. He's brought aboard. He tells his story, and the captain has him put in chains, and he goes back and gets his property and so forth. The guy finally gets out and he writes this the book of the adventures that they had, and it sounds so much like the other accounts that we've gotten that I think there's overwhelming evidence that there's civilizations under Antarctica. As a matter of fact, they probably gave shelter to the Nazi and SS who were fleeing from Argentina and South Africa. And this was part of the force that defeated Byrd in the Battle of the Weddell Sea in 1947.
Dr. Sasha, is that right around the time of Operation High Jump as well?
That's exactly part of the whole thing, is that the United States shut Byrd up and they made a deal basically, look, we're not going to kill your top scientists. We're not going to kill, we're going to end the conflict here in Bodland. We can't be aggressive, but all we want is peace. Cleanse our scientists, cleanse our leaders, cleanse the elite that have been fracturing people's minds to make them, Manchurian. Let all our people come in. We'll get all their secrets, and then they and their children and their children's children can be Americans. And this was part of the CIA, controlled by Allen Dulles, and that Kennedy was trying to fight with the information agency that he had. It was supposed to be an alternative, but basically. I think I'm getting elbowed by Jen, and I'm talking too much.
No, keep talking. You just...
Anyway, basically, Hitler was kept alive by Bormann in a castle in Argentina, and Bormann was running the final run of the Nazi submarines and troops. Each SS guy got 4 blonde Ukrainians and so forth. I don't know if any of this is true, but it certainly fits with then the secretary that was protecting Byrd was supposedly thrown out the window because he wanted to blab about what was going on too. Yeah, Forstall.
Sure. It is rather alarming how many Nazis were secretly imported to the United States. So officially we have at least 250,000 missing Nazis after World War II. Some were officially brought here, as you probably know, through Operation Paperclip. They began our American space program, and they basically took what the U.S. Army had done to that point and just upped it exponentially. But a lot of people don't know, we also had a number of Nazi pilots. So after the German surrender, all of the Nazi technology was supposed to stay in Germany, but the United States actually worked with some of them to be able to fly out some of the better aircrafts, like the Messerschmitts, any flying wings that they had. And then I have from a very good source that as terrible as the Nazi propaganda was, the United States was actually fascinated by just how powerful and effective it was at basically mobilizing an entire nation for one cause. And so we also imported as many ministers of German propaganda as we could. And so a number of authors, including the late Jim Marrs, who wrote Rise of the Fourth Reich, have basically commented how the Nazi Party never totally died because its ideals are still very alive and well here in America today.
Well, there's a story that they actually won, that we just signed a little kind of back down peace for the moment, but the Nazis actually won World War II, and that was
that's an interesting take.
Yeah, it is. And so anyway, this gets into politics, but apparently they're still in control, and we're actually being run by the Nazi Party, and all this stuff about the two political opposites. It's just a ploy to keep us occupied and not paying attention.
Yeah, Len Kasdan, who did a lot of research on the retrieval of craft and so forth, basically it came to the conclusion that people from the planet Serpo, which is in the Zeta Reticular group, were looking at our facilities at Los Alamos. And because they were interested in the nukes, and they basically saw that we had lost the Battle of the Weddell Sea, and they sent they sacrificed some ships, and then they arranged an exchange with 12 Americans going to Serpo, and some of them stayed there, and they said it's like Idaho, and some of them came back, and they sent an ambassador who was like a technician who helped our people make a craft that could stand up to the Nazis, and that was partly why the Nazis didn't go ahead once they had the help of anti-grav craft, which had blown up. They sunk the Pine Island in the Battle of the Weddell Sea. They killed 42 Marines. They captured Byrd and then let him go. So they basically could have won, except for the Serpo, who are tall, gray kind of guys, helped, so the story goes, helped us develop our own military, had its defense force with the same kind of craft and capability. I don't know if any of that is true, but it accounts for some of the data and what Kennedy had wanted with the Defense Information Agency after 25 years for all this material to be made public. But it's the CIA and basically George Bush and those guys won, and they've been in charge ever since.
That's certainly a lot there, Dr. Sasha. I don't think I disagree with any of it. I am fascinated by the Serpo account. I have Kasten's book, Secret Journey to Planet Serpo. I've also read the graphic novel, and I'm somewhat on the fence. On one hand, I think there is some evidence that there could have been a technology exchange, but two of my biggest issues with the Serpo account is part of it presumes that they had a faster than light communication network which was built. Because as you alluded to, the Zeta Reticuli star system is about 40 light years away. So in theory, just to send and receive a message from the astronauts we had at Serpo would take 80 years. And in the account, they can communicate relatively rapidly. I have also read every single one of the Serpo disclosures, and I think there are over 40 of them, and they're an absolutely fascinating read. And as you alluded to, Kennedy may have known about it, and then some people ask, was our own space program somewhat of a front for Serpo? And so there's definitely interesting things about it. My only issue is there's very little hard data from Serpo that was allegedly brought back. You have these wonderful accounts written by somebody, but despite them supposedly taking thousands and thousands of rolls of film there and all these pictures and all these data, so far only one picture has ever actually surfaced from the account. And a lot of people have critiqued it as just probably being a picture in the desert in the southwestern United States. So I'm not saying that it didn't happen, but I'm very much on the fence about it. But I definitely find the whole account fascinating. Some people have even gone so far to allege that Serpo itself was disinformation to try to sort of confuse people on the real secret space program. So as we alluded to in the first hour, there's just a ton of overlap and misinformation with all of these different stories.
One thing that counter hypothesis would be that the speed of light is a spurious limitation, and that when the singularities line up, there's instantaneous communication, which doesn't have to be limited by the speed of light. And what the Serpo said is that basically it was little scout ships that would then meet with a larger ship that was beyond, and then from there they would go to Serpo. And even then, I think they said it took a certain amount of several weeks to get that far. So that if there is a technology that can move communication, one, two, material objects faster than the speed of light, then this again becomes a tenable story with a lot of unknowns.
Right. We have a lot of people that.
Go ahead, Anna. Sorry. Go ahead.
I just wanted to say real quickly, we interview a lot of people from the secret space program, and they're hinting at or indicating that the technology is way beyond anything we can even begin to imagine, and that they're able to go across the entire solar system in, a few hours, and that we already have colonies on other planets that are outside our solar system, and basically the entire solar system has different colonies throughout everything, just like Star Trek.
Absolutely. One of the best quotes comes from Ben Rich, who is the head of Lockheed Martin Skunk Works. And he basically said that we already have the technology to travel to the stars, but it's buried so deep in black budget programs that it would likely never get out to the public to benefit them. And he directly said anything that you can imagine, we already know how to do. So I completely agree with you. I think it's probably an application of Einstein's general relativity, where they're essentially temporarily warping the space-time around them to bring very distant points very close and then hopping across. So yes, I'm a big believer in that.
I guess go ahead. Well, if we're going to the cosmic level, it really comes down to the questioning. I heard Michio Kaku with guests questioning the Big Bang and the acceleration of the universe spreading out, and whether there should be all light instead of all dark when you look up in the sky. And I got quite lost, and I hope you could explicate the controversy about the Big Bang and tell us what happened before the Big Bang.
Oh, yes, I could do that. That involves some cosmology. So basically, one of the side applications of Albert Einstein's general relativity is he basically proved inadvertently that the universe had to have some shape to it. It couldn't just be what they used to think about ever-present and homogeneous. And so basically, it either had to be spherical, or it had to be flat, or it had to be negatively curved or a saddle shape. And it also essentially proved that the universe could not stay perfectly balanced. It basically either had to be getting bigger or it had to be getting smaller. And Einstein himself, ironically, actually fought this interpretation a lot. He just had this philosophical belief that the universe should essentially be unchanging. But a number of less-known physicists during his own time were able to correctly argue that the universe was expanding. And Edwin Hubble was later able to prove that, and Einstein finally did relent and admitted his mistake. So they've essentially run that expansion backwards, and when they did the math in reverse, they found that around 14 billion years ago, you would get to a point of essentially infinite heat and infinite density that then started to expand, and that was the Big Bang. Now, I do have a couple personal critiques with it. Now, granted, I'm not a cosmologist. There's a lot of people more qualified than me. But to me, one of the issues with the Big Bang is for the universe to be the size it is now, it essentially relies on a very, very rapid period of expansion, and right at the first outset. And we're talking as soon as the universe is birthed, it is at least 6 billion years or light years wide, which theoretically should go against Einstein's special relativity. It says nothing can go faster than light. But astronomers sort of get around this by saying, well, it wasn't actually expanding relative to anything else since there was nothing else, so it should have been okay. So one of the issues that I take with it is, as it's currently written, you have a ridiculous period of seemingly faster than light expansion right from the outset. And there's also a number of experiencers. Janet, I know you referenced being an experiencer, that have supposedly had communications with more advanced civilizations, and they've consistently said that we are wrong on our interpretation of the universe, whether it's its expansion rate, whether it's the shape, whether it's the age of it. But something that we currently think is a bedrock of science is due for a pretty big upset in the future.
You know, one thing that seems apparent is that by the two-slit experiment, that when you that the future, the past and the future change, because cameras set up at the beginning before the wave is passed through the windows changes the beginning as well as the ending.
Oh, and that's some really fascinating stuff. And then that gets into causality. And I just read an article the other day where some physicists, and I think this is brilliant, they're starting to really question whether time itself actually exists. Because time, as we know it, it's essentially a human construct that we have to use as a reference point to measure different distances. But a number of experiencers have supposedly been told that our idea of time is not actually right. And this even ties into people with near-deaths. A number of people who have these experiences of seeing heaven or a higher frequency or whatever you're comfortable calling it, they consistently say that their eyes were opened and they saw everything in the universe happening all at once. And so a new theory is we shouldn't be thinking about time as linear. This is the past, this is the present, this is the future. Time is basically a muddled mess where everything is happening all at the same instant. But because of our mortal coils here, because of our perspective, we're only able to see just this one window into time.
And that's exactly right. And I've had that experience as an experiencer where everything was all at once. And it's hard to translate because everything here is linear, so we have to explain it in language. But beyond language, everything can be changed and created and shifted, and so it's the perceived. We are basically God creating everything around us, and so if we don't like this reality, we can shift it. But of course, we're in this game, so we don't know that we have this ability. Go ahead.
Philosophically, I can see that it's our proclivity toward dichotomization which gives us these dilemmas. And when you start saying, there's before and after, that's you can assume that's a spurious dichotomy and a function of our intellect rather than the phenomenological reality.
Oh, absolutely. And I think what's really opened my eyes to this, a couple years ago, I don't know if you both have heard of this, but a new computer game came out. It was called No Man's Sky. And it's what is known as an MMORPG, massive multiplayer online role-playing game. And it is basically mimicking our own universe, but it was created by a supercomputer. And what's phenomenal about this game is they estimate, the creators don't even know, there are at least 4 quadrillion worlds within this game. And it's so big, even if everybody on Earth played it all at the same time for the rest of their lives, we could still not explore it at all. And one of the terrifying things to me is the designers of this game obviously didn't design all these planets. They basically gave a supercomputer all the conditions of this technological universe. And the supercomputer made it all up itself. And so one of the fascinating things is looking at our own universe then, people really start to wonder, what are we defining as God? If our computers with our relative primitive technology can do that, who's to say a more advanced civilization couldn't make a reality that we thought was real? So one of the sort of cutting edge things in physics that's actually been pretty well respected is physicists and cosmologists are trying to take a real look at whether our universe is a simulation or a hologram. So I think we might be on the verge of some fascinating and maybe alarming breakthroughs as well.
Right. And I agree. I think we're in a simulation. And that's why if we get out of playing victim, then we can actually do something about everything that we think we're a victim about. But no, just don't sit there, do something, and keep adjusting it until you find something that's a win for all and that work for everybody, instead of top down, I win, you lose, and you die and you suffer and everything. So once we get into that mindset that it's not that there's a God external, we are God. And like in terms, let's say we're great and we're better than everybody else, we're all equal.
So I guess the answer to the question of what was before the Big Bang is before is a intellectual category that's only there for our convenience, and it doesn't exist.
Oh, it could be, Dr. Sasha. The other possibility is if we aren't going towards a big freeze, if our measurements are wrong and we are going towards what's called a big crunch, eventually everything will come back together again, and then a new universe would rise from the old one like the ashes, like a phoenix from the ashes. So if that possibility is true, the other argument is we don't even really know which reincarnation of the universe we're actually in. So it's pretty fascinating.
We don't know. We know everything. We don't know everything.
Would it be okay if we talk just a little bit about Atlantis before we end tonight? Because I had some good stuff. Okay. So the one other scientist that I wanted to mention was a geologist. His name was Charles Hapgood. This was 1958. And he wrote a book called Earth's Shifting Crust. And he believed that the plates might not move slowly. So there's a layer under the plates that's called the asthenosphere. And it's always likened to basically like a putty, like a silly putty, because it's very hot. Hapgood believed that the plates might move together rigidly and they could slide all at once. And he had a really prominent scientist in his corner, none other than Albert Einstein. He and Einstein had corresponded back and forth frequently, and Einstein at the time believed so much in the theory that he actually wrote the foreword for Hapgood's book. So this dovetails really nicely with Atlantis and Antarctica. So as you all probably know, people have looked for Atlantis for ages. Some people think it's off the Bimini Road. Some people think it's the eye of the desert in Africa. Others think it might be in France. But one theory is Atlantis has been staring us plain in the face all this time, and we didn't realize it. And that's that Atlantis is actually Antarctica. So in theory, Antarctica was actually very, very close to Earth's equator. But then during this passage of Nibiru or some other solar system interloper, the entire crust shifted rapidly, and Antarctica wound up down at the South Pole and was quickly covered over in ice. And there actually is some evidence to support this, because I'm sure you're going to want it, Dr. Sasha. But we have a number of maps of Antarctica, like the Piri-Reis map and the Orontes Phineas map, which were both done during the Dark Ages in the 1500s. Somehow people back then knew about Antarctica a good 350 years before it was officially discovered. And what's even more amazing is on the Orontes Phineas map, he actually, this was a French cartographer, by the way, he depicted mountain ranges and river basins that are currently buried under miles of ice. And we didn't even know what the land outline of Antarctica was until about the 1980s when they did seismic soundings. And so if Atlantis really is Antarctica, if it got rapidly shifted down there, that would certainly explain the Nazi interest. That would certainly explain Operation High Jump. And that would certainly explain why a number of people from Buzz Aldrin to John Kerry have all gone to Antarctica very, very recently. So the conspiracy is there are things in Antarctica, and they're actively digging down and excavating to try to find whatever technology is left there.
Right. They usually cover that with the war effort, but they're just, how do they keep everybody off of Antarctica? You have to get a special permit to go there or something?
That's correct. Only scientific research is allowed, and there are only, I believe, 2 scientific outposts, and there are a number of no-fly zones in Antarctica where even military pilots, if they've accidentally gone over those areas, or one pilot came forward where he was doing an emergency medevac, and to get to this soldier quicker, he went over this no-fly zone and got totally reamed out coming back. And it's apparently an area where there's a large subsurface geothermically heated lake right under the ice of Antarctica. So it's definitely still a continent that is shrouded in a lot of mystery to this day.
Wow. You make a lot of sense. So why did so you're saying that that's where Atlantis, how did ocean named the Atlantic Ocean?
I don't know that. I should know that. I'm not sure it was named after Atlantis. One of the interesting things, for many years I was skeptical of Atlantis, and I'm still somewhat on the fence simply because we seem to only have one point source, and that was the Greek philosopher Plato. He wrote about it 2 different times, and like a lot of his work, it's very nebulous. So as you both probably know, he just mentions it being an enormous naval power on like a multi-ringed island that was somewhere beyond the Pillars of Hercules, which we now liken to the mouth of the Mediterranean. So Plato didn't give us a lot to go on. Basically, it's just somewhere out there in the Atlantic. So I'm not totally sure if I'm convinced that Antarctica is Atlantis, but after reading about Hapgood's theory and reading about the really out-of-the-box idea that our crust could shift rapidly, I think it does solve a lot of unanswered questions and tidies things up pretty well.
Okay. Sasha, do you have any comments or questions?
Oh, I think this it's so interesting because there's dozens of Atlantean theories, but one of the ones that Swerdlow reports was that after the Dracos attacked the Lyrans and they scattered all over, one group of Lyran warriors whose planet had been bombarded were called the Atlans. And when the Federation got it together, they landed the Atlans on Atlantis, which had by then had been covered up by cover the Dracos and their dinosaurs, and that the extinction of the dinosaurs was because the Atlans shot them with their laser guns, and so that's part of the story. But basically. And then the people, the Maldecans, who had been taking shelter under Mars with the Martians, landed in the Gobi, and they coordinated their attacks on the Dracos, who then went underground. Meantime, ships from the Galactic Federation and from Mars bombarded the Dracos on Venus, got rid of them, and also got them off of Mars. So that's the story that the CIA shared with Stewart.
One of the interesting things is back around 1952, they convened a group called the Robertson Panel. So we hadn't yet been into outer space, but the United States could see the direction we were going and the way the Soviets were going, and they knew that man's conquest of outer space would be inevitable. And so they essentially convened this think tank of scientists, military officials. Einstein was rumored to be in it, but some people say he wasn't. But they came to 2 startling conclusions. The whole group agreed that, number one, it would be very likely during our exploration of the inner solar system that we would find ruins of more advanced civilizations from a longer time ago. And number 2, they said that they should keep that idea from the public because we would not be able to handle that reality. And so a lot of people think that the government has been acting on the recommendations of the Robertson Panel ever since. So anytime I hear these stories about older civilizations battling it out, I don't dismiss them anymore because it also dovetails really nicely with the Vimanas and the sky battles of the Indian Vedic texts as well.
And the residues, tephra, left from thermonuclear explosions on the Sinai Peninsula and Harappa on the Indus River. They show populations struck down by radioactivity and holes from explosions. And the kind of pebbles you had left at Hiroshima that used to be people is what you find in some of the places that Sitchin says were bombed in a thermonuclear war among the factions of the Anunnaki.
People always found it interesting. After testing the first atomic weapon, Robert Oppenheimer ends up quoting from the Bhagavad Gita that he became death, the destroyer of worlds. Even looking at the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah from the Old Testament, a lot of people think when it says Lot's wife was turned to salt, they thought that meant physical salt. And there's even a pillar of salt over in the Middle East that they call Lot's wife. But my take and I think a couple people have this take, is salt may have meant disintegrated. So basically, she tried to go back while Lot and the rest of his family fled, and then she was essentially just incinerated by the power of this blast. So I find the discovery of green glass very consistent with today's nuclear tests, and I think it's fascinating because there's no other good explanation so far for it.
Janet, what do you want to ask?
Well, we have about 10 minutes, 8 minutes left.
I wanted to, okay, tell me about the inside of the sun. How does the sun work? How do the storms come out? How come it's not hotter and things like that?
Oh, I can actually answer that. So astronomers were actually puzzled through probably the late 1800s into the early 1900s on how the sun actually worked. And it didn't burn like a fire burns here on Earth, because they knew if that was the case, it wouldn't have enough material to last for more than a couple thousand years. And so then the theory was the pressure of the sun was causing that heat. But that couldn't be right, because that would only make it last a couple million years. And so basically, they had to come up with some type of methodology that would allow it to basically heat for billions and billions of years. And so around the same time, the first physicists actually split the atom, and we started to enter the nuclear age. And so they looked at the possibility of nuclear fusion, and it basically checked off all the marks, and it very correctly showed why the sun has the balance of elements in it that it does. And it's also the only power source that we know of so far that could actually allow this object to burn for billions and billions of years. And so for listeners, basically every second of every day, trillions of times per second in the core, two tiny atoms of hydrogen are smashing together to form one atom of helium. And initially it seems counterintuitive, because normally anytime you take smaller things to make bigger things, that costs you energy, right? But this actually makes energy, because it's something called the nuclear binding strength, which basically means how much energy it takes to hold the nucleus of an atom together. And it turns out it takes a slightly lesser amount to hold one bigger helium atom together than two little hydrogens. So when they smash together, it makes a helium, and it releases that excess amount of energy. And that's why we're alive. And people would be astounded if they saw how much mass the sun loses. The estimates I've read, every single second, the sun is losing anywhere from 2,000 to 20,000 tons of mass every single second from this reaction. But it's prolific enough that it's been going on for at least 4.5 billion years. And our sun's got enough left in the tank to do it for another 4.5 billion more.
Is it getting smaller? Is the sun getting smaller?
Oh, good question. It's actually, Dr. Sasha, going to do the opposite someday. So right now, we're nicely balanced between the outward push of the sun and the inward crush of gravity. I always liken it to a seesaw. But someday, as our sun's inner shells start to condense, it's going to actually start burning some of its helium, and it is actually going to start to expand outward. The seesaw is actually going to start to teeter towards star energy, and our sun's going to enter what's called the red giant stage. And when this does happen, if Earth is still here and there are still descendants of humans on it, if we can't find a way to physically move the Earth away from it, the sun's actually going to engulf it whole. But I always tell the students not to panic. It's not going to start next Tuesday. It's still billions of years away, and they already have at least one idea on how they could physically move the Earth away from the sun when it happens.
And what is that?
Oh, okay. I'm glad you asked. So the idea is gradually we could capture a fleet of comets and redirect them into an orbit that would take them around Earth at one end and mighty Jupiter at the other end. And so when the comet swarm loops around Jupiter, they're going to capture some of that planet's angular momentum. And then when it loops around the other direction around the Earth, they're going to transfer that angular momentum to the Earth. So with every passing loop, the Earth is going to move farther and farther away from the sun. So someday, if another civilization was watching our solar system, they would see this yellow star turn red and start to swell up. Then they'd see this teeny tiny little blue planet moving away from it. But there's still a lot of problems. If we don't deflect them the right way, they could actually careen into the Earth rather than save us. And once we got the Earth going, we would have the opposite problem then of having to slow down the Earth once we got it far enough from the sun. But that's certainly for future generations to worry about. And hopefully by then we've already recognized other star systems.
So what do you think about the idea that Nibiru was captured and brought into this? Maybe they were escaping a similar...
Sirius C went nova, and basically that's one of the theories, that Sirius C went nova, and Nibiru was either moved out of away from the explosion. That's one version of it. The other one is that they were given some technology by people called the Coups that helped them guide their planet.
Well, I think a lot of evidence has come out just since 2018 that visitors are definitely possible. You might both remember there was an interstellar asteroid named Oumuamua that looped through our solar system in 2018. It was very unique. It's the first object we can prove came from outside the solar system. It was also very elongated. And a Harvard astronomer, well-respected, made news when he came out publicly and believed it was either an extraterrestrial spaceship or it was an asteroid but had a solar sail attached to it. Because this is also the first object we've ever seen that, as it left the sun and moved away from the sun, started to accelerate. And that totally goes against Kepler's laws of planetary motion and Newton's laws of motion. So to both of your points, I think the likelihood is actually growing stronger because just 2 years ago, we saw the first proof that it can definitely happen.
Wow.
So when do you think we're going to get we have one more minute. Just how do we tell us about the event? You're going to be
absolutely, I will. So John Ventry, even though he's not officially affiliated with MUFON anymore, he still has been coordinating our conferences. And this one is in Philadelphia. It's in April. It's the Friday in April, I believe, April 23rd. And it is actually a multi-day conference. We have a special training that Friday for field investigators. I'm running an astronomy workshop, and a number of people are running different workshops on being better investigators. And then that Saturday, we've always been blessed with some very big names. This year, I've heard him speak a couple times. He's a great guy. Bill Byrne from the History Channel is going to be talking about accidents and their relation to UFOs. And this is when I'm also going to be doing this presentation on Planet X and Nibiru. And a couple days before, Jen Stein, whom I think you know, Janet, she's okay. She's coordinating a conference that Tuesday, and I'm speaking there as well.
Wow. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. This was great.